Love can be the perfect mask for greed, and trust can be the easiest door for betrayal to walk through. What follows is not just the collapse of a relationship, but the exposure of a truth that flips the balance of power in the most dramatic way. This isn't a tale you can skim, it's one you'll feel in every turn, leading to an ending that redefines justice. Subscribe now, add your voice in the comments about the plot, and let me know the place you're watching from so we can share this journey together. Derek Johnson had always known life would be an uphill climb. As a black man born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, he grew up surrounded by reminders of how society often measured people not by their character, but by the color of their skin. His mother, Lillian Johnson, worked long hours as a cleaning lady, teaching him that dignity did not come from wealth or power, but from how one carried themselves in the world. She often told him, "Derek, the world may try to keep you small, but never forget, your worth comes from within." Those words stayed with him even after her passing, shaping him into the man he would become. Derek found his calling in teaching, becoming a high school English teacher. He was passionate about literature, using it as a tool to show his students, many of them from underprivileged backgrounds, that their voices mattered. To his students, he was more than a teacher. He was a mentor, a guide, someone who listened when no one else would. But outside the classroom, Derek led a modest life. His salary barely covered rent and car payments, and he held on to the small piece of land his mother had left him, never realizing its hidden value. Despite the struggles, Derek carried himself with quiet pride. He knew who he was, and he believed in the goodness of hard work. Then Catherine Miller entered his world, and everything he thought he knew about his future shifted. Catherine was a woman from an entirely different universe. Born into generational wealth, she had never known what it meant to choose between paying bills or fixing a broken car. Her family was well known in the city, tied to banks, corporations, and charities that carried their last name. Catherine was striking tall, graceful, always dressed in a way that made heads turn. When Derek first met her at a charity gala, he felt like an outsider. He had been invited by a colleague who received discounted tickets. Surrounded by men in tailored suits and women in diamond jewelry, Derek's secondhand suit felt out of place. He stuck to the edges of the room, quietly sipping his drink. But Catherine noticed him. She approached with a smile that could disarm anyone and began asking him questions about education. He expected her to lose interest quickly, as most wealthy people did when they learned he was just a teacher. Instead, she leaned in, laughing at his dry humor, fascinated by his dedication to his students. For Derek, the attention was both surprising and intoxicating. Their courtship moved quickly. Catherine invited him to fine dining restaurants, took him on weekend getaways, and showered him with gifts he never would have imagined receiving. At first, Derek was uncomfortable with the imbalance her wealth against his modest means, but she told him she admired his authenticity, that he wasn't like the men in her circles who only cared about money and appearances. Derek wanted to believe her. For the first time, he felt like someone from the world of privilege truly saw him for who he was. Within 6 months, Catherine proposed engagement. The diamond ring she placed on his finger sparkled so brightly it drew whispers even among her wealthy friends. Derek hesitated only for a moment, thinking of his mother's advice never to measure himself against anyone else. He told himself love was enough, that maybe their union was proof that barriers of race and class could be broken. He said yes, believing he was stepping into a future filled with hope. Their wedding was a spectacle. Catherine's family spared no expense, hosting a grand ceremony attended by politicians, CEOs, and socialites. Derek's side was modest by comparison: relatives from Alabama, a handful of colleagues, and former students. Standing at the altar, Derek felt the weight of the room, the eyes that questioned what a black teacher could possibly offer a wealthy white woman. But when Catherine looked at him and smiled, he let himself believe their love silenced all doubts. In the early months of marriage, life seemed perfect. Catherine bought them a luxurious home in the suburbs, decorated with furniture too fine for Derek's tastes, but symbolizing the life she wanted to build with him. She reassured him that he didn't need to worry about money, that she could handle their finances, and that he should focus on teaching. At first, Derek resisted. His mother had raised him to be independent, to never let someone else control his sense of worth. But Catherine's insistence sounded like love, so he relented. Derek smiled through the sting, reminding himself she had grown up in a world where people measured worth in dollars rather than in the lives they touched, but it hurt all the same. The more she hosted dinner parties for her colleagues and high society friends, the more Derek felt himself shrinking in his own home. When someone asked about his work, Catherine would answer before he could, saying, "Oh, he's just a teacher," and then quickly change the subject back to investment portfolios, corporate deals, or the next charity gala. The way she said "just a teacher" hung in the air like a brand, making Derek feel invisible. Worse still, she began to take jabs at his background, sometimes cloaked in humor, but always heavy with disdain. She reminded him often that her family's wealth spanned generations, that she came from a long line of people who built this city while he came, as she put it one evening after a glass of wine, from nothing. She would laugh and add, "Don't take it personally, Derek, it's just the truth." But each remark chipped away at the dignity his mother had instilled in him. When he spoke of his mother with pride, recalling how she had sacrificed everything to raise him, Catherine rolled her eyes and said, "You really need to stop romanticizing being poor. My family built legacies. Your family cleaned up after them." The cruelty of those words pierced him, but he stayed silent, unwilling to escalate a fight he knew would only end with her dismissing his feelings. The first year of their marriage blurred with these moments: lavish dinners followed by quiet humiliation, expensive gifts that felt like payment for silence, and constant reminders that he was the outsider in her world. At school, however, Derek found relief. His students loved him, admired him, and looked to him as a mentor who saw them not as statistics, but as individuals worth fighting for. He poured himself into their success, staying late to help them with essays, cheering at their games, listening when they confided fears they couldn't share at home. These moments reminded him who he was and why his work mattered, but the contrast to his home life made the cracks in his marriage more obvious. Catherine's disdain grew bolder. At one dinner party, Derek tried to contribute to a conversation about current events, offering a thoughtful perspective on education policy. Catherine interrupted him with a laugh and said, "Sweetheart, let the adults handle this," prompting her friends to chuckle while Derek forced a smile. Inside, he felt humiliated, reduced from a partner to a prop, meant to make her look progressive, the wealthy white woman who had married a black man she could show off when convenient. The warmth she once displayed in public had been replaced with condescension, and though Derek tried to excuse it as stress or cultural differences, the truth gnawed at him. Even the memory of his mother became a point of tension. When Derek grew quiet and admitted he missed her, Catherine sighed impatiently. "Derek, you really need to stop dwelling on the past. Your mother was just a cleaning lady. You're married to me now. Focus on what's ahead, not on where you came from." That statement cut deeper than any other, because his mother's memory was sacred, the foundation of his identity, the source of his strength. To hear it dismissed so casually revealed something dark about Catherine, but Derek still clung to the hope that love could overcome these differences. He began to retreat into himself, smiling less, speaking less, trying not to give Catherine any excuse to belittle him. He told himself marriage was about compromise, that he could endure these slights, that they were nothing compared to the privilege of living in a beautiful home with a woman who had once made him feel like the most important man in the world. But deep inside, the seeds of doubt were growing. The tension between his two worlds, school and home, only intensified. At school, a student named Jamal once told him, "Mr. Johnson, you make me believe I can be somebody." That single statement filled Derek with pride, reminding him that his worth could never be measured by Catherine's standards. At home, though, Catherine dismissed such achievements as trivial. When he told her about Jamal's progress, she laughed and said, "That's nice, Derek, but it's not exactly changing the world, is it?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, and Derek felt himself deflate, the joy of his student's success snuffed out by her scorn. Each day became a balancing act, nourishing his soul at school, enduring his slow erosion at home. Catherine's superiority complex, laced with subtle and not-so-subtle racism, pressed against him like an unyielding weight. Derek tried to bury the growing awareness that the woman he had married not only failed to see his worth, but actively sought to diminish it. He reminded himself of his vows, of the love he thought they shared, and of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But in the quiet moments alone, when he replayed Catherine's words in his head, He began to realize that the dream he thought he had entered was cracking from the inside, revealing a truth far harsher than he had been willing to admit. The cracks in Derek Johnson's marriage to Catherine Miller widened into painful gaps as the months wore on, and soon those small, dismissive remarks that once came like passing breezes hardened into walls between them that he could not break through no matter how much effort he gave. Where there had once been warmth and occasional tenderness, there was now a constant chill that settled over their home like a permanent fog. Catherine began staying out later, brushing off his questions with vague excuses about work dinners or meetings that stretched far beyond office hours. When she returned, the smell of perfume that was not hers sometimes clung faintly to her clothes, and her explanations were delivered in a tone that dared him to challenge her. Derek felt the tension rise inside him, but he bit his tongue, convincing himself that confrontation would only make matters worse. He told himself he had to be patient, that perhaps this was just a stressful season in her life, yet deep down he knew something was wrong, something he could no longer deny. At home, silence became their most common form of communication. Meals that had once been opportunities for conversation now consisted of Catherine scrolling through her phone while Derek sat across the table trying to fill the emptiness with questions about her day. She would answer in curt phrases, or sometimes not at all, leaving him to chew through the heavy quiet. The romantic gestures that once swept him off his feet had completely vanished, replaced by a mechanical routine in which Catherine barely acknowledged his presence. The same woman who once made him feel like he mattered more than anything now treated him like a shadow, an accessory to be tolerated rather than a partner to be cherished. Yet in school, Derek's world remained alive, full of energy and meaning. His students saw him as more than just a teacher. They saw him as someone who believed in their potential when the rest of the world doubted them. He stayed late tutoring kids who had fallen behind, guided after-school programs, and attended basketball games and choir concerts to show support. One student, a bright young girl named Alicia, confided in him about her troubled home life, and Derek became the one adult she trusted. When she eventually earned a scholarship to college, she hugged him tightly and whispered, "Mr. Johnson, you saved me." Those words filled him with pride and gave him purpose, proof that his work mattered more than Catherine would ever admit. But the contrast between the respect he received at school and the disrespect he endured at home created an ache inside him. Catherine's insults became sharper and more brazen, often masked as jokes told in front of others. At a dinner party, she smirked as she said, "Derek doesn't have to worry about real problems like we do, he just talks about books all day," earning laughs from her friends while Derek forced a polite smile that concealed the humiliation burning in his chest. Each time she minimized his life's work, he felt smaller, as though she were erasing not just his profession, but his very identity. Worse still, she continued to diminish his mother's memory. One evening, when Derek mentioned how proud his mom would have been to see him guiding young students, Catherine scoffed and muttered, "Your mother cleaned toilets, Derek." Stop pretending that means something grand. The cruelty of those words struck him like a physical blow, and though he swallowed his anger, inside he began to realize that love alone could not survive such disdain. Her condescension soon turned into control. She began monitoring their finances more closely, reminding him often that the house and most of their assets were in her name. She told him it was better that way since he wasn't experienced with money, and though Derek bristled, he let it pass, thinking confrontation would only widen the gap. Catherine seemed to relish this power, subtly reinforcing that he should be grateful she had chosen him, a black man with no wealth, when she could have married any number of successful white men from her circles. The poison of those words seeped into his mind, making him question his worth despite everything his mother had taught him. Still, Derek clung to the idea of compromise. He told himself he had promised vows, that he needed to endure the hard times in order to protect what they had built. But more and more, he realized what they had built was a facade, a house of cards balanced on illusions. Catherine's late nights, the secretive phone calls, the dismissive laughter, all pointed toward a truth he did not want to face. She no longer saw him as a partner, she saw him as an obstacle, someone to belittle until he disappeared. The worst moments came late at night when Derek lay awake beside her while she slept soundly, his heart pounding with unspoken fear. He wondered if he had made a mistake marrying into her world, if the love he thought had conquered race and class was nothing more than a mask she had worn until she grew tired of pretending. He thought of his mother's voice urging him to remember his worth, But in the quiet darkness, Catherine's cruel words echoed louder, drowning out the encouragement he had once carried like armor. The growing distance in Derek Johnson's marriage had already hollowed out much of his spirit, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when the illusions he still clung to were finally stripped away to reveal the cruel truth of Catherine Miller's intentions. He had grown accustomed to the silence, the cold dinners, the late nights that stretched into early mornings, and even the whispers on the phone that ended when he entered the room. Still, he told himself to be patient, to endure, because perhaps somewhere deep down Catherine still cared for him. Perhaps there was still a trace of the love she had once shown. That fragile hope shattered one Tuesday evening when Derek returned home from a parent-teacher conference feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He had spent the evening with a student's family, crafting a plan that would help the boy catch up in school, and he wanted to share his small victory with his wife, thinking that maybe she would be proud. He walked into the house quietly, and the sound of laughter guided him toward Catherine's study. Her laughter was different from the affectionate laugh she had once reserved for him. It was sharp, hollow, a sound laced with cruelty. Derek paused in the hallway, frozen, as Catherine's words drifted out into the still air. "Trust me, he has no idea. He's so naive, it's almost cute. He really thinks I married him for love." Her laughter followed, cold and merciless, and Derek felt his chest tighten as though the air had been sucked from the room. He pressed himself against the wall, every muscle trembling, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might give him away. He listened as she continued, her voice low but laced with arrogance. "Of course I had him sign the prenup. Do you think I'm stupid? When we divorce, he'll get nothing. Meanwhile, I'll get everything, his mother's land included." He signed it all over without realizing what it meant. He's been so easy to control. A few gifts, some fancy dinners, and he handed me everything. Honestly, I should get an award for this performance. 3 years of pretending to love someone so boring, so ordinary. But it'll be worth it when I cash out. On the other end of the line, her friend must have said something funny because Catherine's laughter burst again, echoing like a cruel drumbeat that hammered away at Derek's already fragile heart. He stood there in the shadows, paralyzed by the realization that everything he had built with her, every ounce of love he had poured into their marriage, was nothing more than a scheme in her eyes. The woman he believed had seen him for who he truly was, had seen only an opportunity, a chance to exploit the black teacher who had grown up poor, who would never question her authority because she cloaked it in the guise of love. Derek backed away quietly, his legs unsteady as though the ground beneath him had shifted. He reached their bedroom and sat in silence, staring into the dark while his mind replayed every insult, every dismissive laugh, every belittling word. It all made sense now, the control over their finances, the way she used his mother's land as collateral without his full understanding, the way she reminded him to be grateful she had chosen him. It had never been love, not really. It had been a carefully constructed performance designed to make him believe he was part of a fairy tale, when in truth he was the mark of a con that had been unfolding since the day they met. When Catherine finally ended her call and climbed into bed beside him, she kissed his forehead as though nothing had changed, whispering, "Good night, sweetheart." Derek lay rigid, his body cold, pretending to sleep while his world collapsed. The following morning she went about her routine with the same careless grace as always, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone before leaving for work. Derek sat at the kitchen table long after she was gone, his mind numb, his hands trembling as he held the coffee cup he could not bring himself to drink from. He thought of his mother, thought of how she had warned him never to forget his worth, and he felt ashamed that he had let Catherine convince him otherwise. He pulled out the files and documents Catherine had once insisted he sign, flipping through them with a desperation that bordered on panic. With each page, the truth hit harder. She had set everything up, step by step, ensuring that he would be left with nothing while she claimed not only the house and accounts but also the last piece of his mother's legacy. For days, Derek moved through his life in a haze, going to school, teaching his students, smiling when he needed to, but inside, he was crumbling. At night, he lay awake, listening to Catherine's even breathing beside him, wondering how someone could betray another so completely, how she could smile at him during the day while plotting to strip him of everything he held dear. He thought of confronting her, thought of demanding answers, but each time the image of her smug expression, her cruel laughter, kept him silent. He knew now he could not trust her, not with his heart, not with his future, not with his mother's land. She kissed his cheek, sat down beside him on the couch, and spoke in a tone that was calm, almost rehearsed, saying, "Derek, darling, we need to talk." The words chilled him before she even continued, and though he already knew what was coming, hearing it aloud still cut deep. She explained that their marriage had run its course, that they had grown apart, that it would be better for both of us if they ended things now while they could do so peacefully. Derek sat frozen as she took his hands in hers, her eyes feigning concern while her thumb traced circles on his knuckles. She spoke of divorce as if it were a gift she was offering him, a chance to start fresh, but Derek could see the triumph glinting faintly in her expression. When he asked what she meant, Catherine smiled thinly and said, "I've already spoken to my lawyer. Everything is ready. All we need are signatures. I don't want this to be messy, Derek. I want us to separate like adults. I'll even make sure you're taken care of." She placed a manila folder on the coffee table between them, sliding it toward him as if it contained the key to his freedom rather than the shackles she had crafted for him. Derek stared at the folder, his stomach twisting with dread, his heart pounding so hard it was difficult to breathe. He asked quietly about the house, about his mother's land, desperate to test if she would betray her words with the truth he had overheard. Catherine's smile faltered for the briefest of moments before she smoothly replied, "Well, technically the house is in my name, and the land is collateral for the mortgage. But don't worry, Derek. The settlement will make sure you're comfortable. You'll get enough money to find a nice apartment, maybe go back to school, maybe start over." Her voice was syrupy, her tone patronizing, the words of someone who believed she was speaking to a man too naive to understand the trap being set. That night, Derek could not sleep. He opened the folder after she had gone to bed and read every line of the divorce agreement under the dim glow of his desk lamp. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was painfully clear. Catherine would keep nearly everything: the house, the cars, the investment accounts, and worst of all, the land his mother had left him. According to the documents, the land would be sold to pay down the supposed marital debt tied to their mortgage, and any excess would be directed to Catherine as compensation for her financial contributions. Derek's portion, by contrast, was insultingly small, a modest settlement that might allow him to rent a simple apartment for a year or two if he lived carefully. It was not just unfair, it was devastating, a complete erasure of everything his mother had worked for, everything Derek had fought to preserve. He felt his hands tremble as he turned each page, anger and despair mixing into a toxic storm within him. Over the next several days, Catherine pushed him with increasing urgency. She reminded him that the sooner they filed, the easier it would be, the cleaner the separation. She used the same gentle voice, the same faux kindness, pressing him to sign away his life as though it were a matter of practicality rather than the ruthless theft it truly was. Each time Derek hesitated, she tilted her head and sighed, saying things like, "Sweetheart, don't drag this out. We both know it's over. I'm just trying to make this easier for you." He nodded when she spoke, hiding his knowledge, hiding the rage burning inside him, refusing to give her the satisfaction of knowing he had overheard her treachery. Instead, he played along, careful and patient, knowing he needed time to plan his next move. At school, Derek wore his pain like an invisible weight, but he refused to let it affect his students. He smiled, he taught with energy, and he celebrated their victories even as his own life seemed to collapse around him. His students gave him strength, grounding him in a world where he was valued and respected, reminding him that Catherine's cruel view of his worth was not the truth. Yet when he returned home, the contrast was unbearable, the silence of their house suffocating, the knowledge of her betrayal pressing down like a constant reminder that the woman who shared his bed was not his partner, but his enemy. One evening, as Catherine pressed him again to sign, Derek asked softly, "And what about the land? What about what my mother left me?" Catherine's smile faltered again, just for an instant, before she replied smoothly, "We've been through this, Derek. That land is tied to the mortgage. It's not really yours anymore. When the house sells, the debt will be settled. It's just paperwork, nothing personal." But to Derek, it was deeply personal. That land was not just soil, it was his mother's legacy, the last piece of her love and sacrifice, and he would not let it be stolen. Derek Johnson sat alone at the kitchen table, the night after Catherine Miller slid the divorce papers across the polished wood, the manila folder staring back at him like a coffin ready to seal shut the last remnants of his mother's legacy. He had read every line, absorbed every clause, and felt the crushing weight of betrayal settle deeper into his chest, but instead of breaking him completely, the realization hardened something inside him. Catherine believed she had cornered him, believed that the humble black teacher who had once marveled at her wealth would simply accept the scraps she offered, but Derek was not that naive boy anymore. He had grown weary of shrinking in his own home, weary of swallowing her contempt, and though the despair still throbbed in his bones, determination began to rise in its place. He resolved that he would not sign those papers, not without a fight, and not without reclaiming the dignity that Catherine had tried to erase. The next morning he called in sick to school for the first time in years. His students had always been his reason to endure, but now he needed time for himself, time to strategize, time to protect what his mother had worked so hard to leave behind. He spent hours digging through every file in their home office, pulling out bank statements, mortgage contracts, and insurance forms that Catherine had once pressed him to sign without question. His heart sank as he realized how thoroughly she had woven her control through every detail of their lives, but he also began to see patterns, small openings that suggested her arrogance had blinded her to potential flaws. Still, Derek knew he could not face this battle alone. He needed someone who understood the system Catherine had mastered, someone who could level the playing field. Through a colleague's referral, he found Angela Brooks, a divorce attorney known for her toughness and relentless advocacy. Angela was a black woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through deceit like a blade. When Derek sat across from her in her modest office and poured out his story, she listened without interruption, her pen scratching across the notepad as he recounted Catherine's insults, her control, and finally the phone call that revealed her scheme. When he finished, Angela leaned back in her chair, tapping the pen against her notebook, and said bluntly, "Derek, if you sign those documents she pushed in front of you, we have a battle ahead. Her lawyers will argue that you willingly handed over control. But battles are meant to be fought, and from the sound of it, she's underestimated you." Derek felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief that someone finally believed him, shame that he had allowed himself to be manipulated, fear of the storm ahead. He asked if he was destined to lose everything, and Angela shook her head. "Not necessarily. We need to be strategic. Tell me about your mother's land." Derek explained that it was little more than empty property with an old barn, something he had always thought of as sentimental rather than valuable. Catherine had told him it was worth almost nothing, which was why it had been used as collateral for the mortgage. Angela's eyes narrowed. "Have you ever had that land appraised?" Derek shook his head, and she leaned forward. "Then that's where we start. You'd be surprised how often people dismiss what they don't understand, and Catherine's confidence tells me she thinks she knows more than she does. That's a weakness." They spent hours reviewing documents together. Angela pointed out clauses Derek had missed, areas where Catherine's legal team had been sloppy, and most importantly, paths to uncover the true worth of his inheritance. Derek left her office with a mixture of hope and skepticism, but mostly with the resolve that he was not powerless, not if he was willing to fight. Catherine had painted him as weak, but Angela's confidence rekindled something he thought he had lost. Back at home, Catherine continued her charade of generosity, cooking him dinner, pouring him wine, speaking in soothing tones about how easy the separation would be if he just signed. Derek played along, nodding, pretending to consider, even thanking her for her kindness. Inside, however, he was building his strength, hiding his resolve behind a mask as carefully constructed as hers. At night, when Catherine slept, he lay awake rehearsing what Angela had told him, reminding himself that his mother had raised him to endure far worse than this, that he had the right to stand up and reclaim what was his. The days that followed were filled with secret meetings and long drives to gather records. Angela arranged for the land to be appraised, assuring Derek that even if it was worth only a fraction of Catherine's claims, it still belonged to him by right. Derek thought often of his mother during those drives, of her weathered hands scrubbing floors, of her voice telling him he was enough. He whispered to her memory that he would not let her down, not now, not when everything she had sacrificed was at stake. At school, Derek maintained his calm exterior, teaching with the same passion as always, but his students noticed something different in his eyes, a spark of intensity that had not been there before. One student asked him quietly if he was okay, and Derek smiled, replying, "I will be." He drew strength from them as much as they drew strength from him, their faith in him serving as a reminder that he was more than Catherine's cruel assessment. more than her scheme. Catherine never suspected a thing because Derek played his part well, feigning indecision about the divorce papers, telling her he needed more time, smiling at her manipulative assurances that she was being generous. All the while, he carried the secret knowledge that something was being uncovered beneath the soil she thought she already owned. When the call finally came from Angela, Derek sat at his desk in the classroom grading essays. Angela's voice was steady but urgent, telling him to sit down before she spoke. "Derek, that land of your mother's, it's not worthless. It's sitting on a natural gas deposit. Based on current appraisals, it could be worth tens of millions." Derek froze, the red pen in his hand falling to the desk, his heart pounding as though his chest could not contain it. He stammered disbelief, insisting his mother had never mentioned anything like that. But Angela explained that mineral rights had become a hot commodity in the county, and energy companies had been quietly trying to buy up properties like his for years. Catherine, in her arrogance, had assumed the land was trivial, perfect for collateral because the bank would hardly notice if it vanished, but she had failed to recognize its true value. Derek felt both vindicated and overwhelmed, the ground shifting beneath him in a way that reversed the narrative Catherine had spun for years. For so long she had told him he was nothing, that his family's legacy was meaningless, that he should be grateful she had chosen him, but now the truth was undeniable. The land his mother had left him, the soil she had worked herself to the bone to preserve, was worth more than Catherine had ever imagined. Angela's revelations did not stop there. She had also dug into his mother's financial records, finding a dormant trust account in Derek's name. His mother, though a cleaning lady, had been careful, setting aside small amounts of money for decades, investing wisely in ways Derek had never known. Compound interest and steady growth had turned those modest contributions into a fortune of over $2 million. The trust had remained untouched because the bank had not been able to locate Derek after his marriage. Catherine's surname had obscured the records, but now it was in plain sight, and it belonged entirely to him. Angela explained that the trust was structured to remain separate from marital assets, protected by law, so that Catherine could never claim it. Derek sat in stunned silence as the reality sank in. The mother he thought had left him with almost nothing had in fact left him with security beyond anything he could have imagined. She had believed in him so deeply that she had planned not just for his survival but for his independence, ensuring he could withstand even the kind of betrayal he now faced. For Derek, the discovery was more than money. It was validation. It was proof that his mother's sacrifices had not been in vain, that her long nights scrubbing floors, her constant reminders of his worth, had built something enduring. Tears filled his eyes as he realized she had been protecting him even after death, shielding him from predators like Catherine, who would try to take advantage of his kindness. The despair that had once suffocated him began to transform into something sharper and more powerful. Catherine thought she had stripped him bare, but she had only exposed her own greed and underestimated the strength of the legacy he carried. Over the following days, Derek and Angela worked tirelessly to prepare for the next steps. Angela reminded him that patience would be critical. Catherine and her attorneys could not suspect the truth until it was revealed in court. If they believed he was broken and defeated, the impact of the revelation would be devastating. Derek agreed, though every moment at home with Catherine felt like walking on shards of glass. She continued to smile sweetly, pushing him to sign, playing the role of the benevolent wife offering charity to her struggling husband. Derek nodded, thanked her for her patience, even kissed her cheek when she leaned in, but inside he burned with knowledge she did not possess. At night he lay awake imagining the moment when Catherine's face would crumble, when the smug smile she wore so effortlessly would vanish as the truth was spoken aloud in front of a judge. He dreamed not of vengeance, but of justice, of finally reclaiming the dignity she had stolen piece by piece. He thought of his students, of Alicia and Jamal and so many others who looked to him as proof that their lives mattered, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight was no longer just about money or property. It was about showing that no matter how often the world tried to erase a man like him, his worth was real, undeniable, and enduring. Angela was meticulous, walking Derek through every possible scenario, reminding him when to remain silent, when to speak, and how to stay composed, no matter how aggressively Catherine's lawyers tried to dismantle him. She stressed that arrogance would be their undoing, and Catherine's smug certainty that she had already won was the greatest weapon they could use against her. Derek listened closely, committing every instruction to memory, carrying his mother's voice with him as a steady echo. Remember who you are. Stand tall. He knew the courtroom would be the stage where his worth would finally be measured not by Catherine's cruel words but by truth itself. The day of the first hearing, Catherine arrived, dressed impeccably, flanked by 2 attorneys from one of the most prestigious firms in the city, their leather briefcases bulging with documents meant to overwhelm and intimidate. She walked into the room with her head high, flashing Derek a look that mingled pity with superiority, the same look she had worn throughout their marriage whenever she wanted to remind him that he was beneath her. To the casual observer, Catherine looked like the generous wife trying to end a failed marriage with dignity, while Derek, dressed in his modest suit, looked like the struggling teacher grateful for scraps. But Derek knew appearances could be deceiving, and beneath the surface lay evidence that would unravel Catherine's lies piece by piece. Angela whispered to him, "Let them think they're winning. Their fall will be harder when the truth hits." As the proceedings began, Catherine's attorneys painted a picture of her as the sole contributor to their wealth, claiming she had provided the home, the lifestyle, and the financial security, while Derek had added little more than a modest teaching salary. They insisted the land had minimal value and should be sold to cover the mortgage, with any remainder distributed fairly, meaning mostly to Catherine. Derek sat silently, his hands folded, his expression calm even as anger flared within him at their distortions. He thought of all the times Catherine had mocked his career, all the times she had diminished his students' successes, and he held on to the knowledge that the truth was coming. When the judge asked if Derek wished to respond, Angela stood for him, her voice steady and commanding as she requested time to submit additional evidence. The judge agreed, and Catherine smirked, clearly believing Angela was grasping at straws. Outside the courtroom, Catherine cornered Derek, her voice low and dripping with false concern. "You're making this harder than it has to be, Derek. If you just sign, you won't have to go through the embarrassment of dragging this out. Think of how small you'll look when the judge rules in my favor. I'm offering you dignity." Derek met her gaze for the first time in weeks, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not the one who decides my dignity, Catherine." For the briefest moment her smile faltered, but she quickly masked it with laughter, waving him off as if he were a child. What she did not know was that her downfall was already set in motion, and each step she took with arrogance only deepened the hole she had dug for herself. Over the following hearings, Catherine continued her performance, sighing dramatically when Derek's modest contributions to the marriage were mentioned, shaking her head as though burdened by the weight of her generosity. Her lawyers repeated the same narrative over and over, portraying her as the magnanimous partner willing to give Derek more than he deserved. Yet, with each repetition, Derek grew stronger inside, reminding himself that patience would deliver the moment of truth. Angela advised him to keep his silence, to let Catherine's arrogance shine, and he did, even when the lies stung like open wounds. He knew the final showdown was coming, and he wanted her unprepared for the impact. Finally, the day of the decisive hearing arrived. Catherine strode into the courtroom in her finest suit, her lawyers carrying stacks of papers they believed would bury Derek's claims. She glanced at him across the room, her expression smug, as though victory were already secured. The judge, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, called the session to order and reviewed the disputed assets, noting the land and Catherine's claims that it should be liquidated. Catherine's lawyer stood, delivering the same argument with confidence, declaring that the property had no meaningful value and must be sold to settle debts. The judge then turned to Angela, asking if she had anything to present. Angela rose slowly, placed a thick folder on the table, and began to speak. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she revealed the appraisal report that valued the land at over $12 million due to the natural gas deposits beneath it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Catherine's face drained of color as her lawyer dropped his pen. Angela continued, presenting documentation of the trust account Derek's mother had established, worth over $2 million, legally protected and separate from marital property. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with Catherine's earlier claims. As the evidence piled up, Catherine shifted in her seat, her confidence unraveling. Angela did not stop there. She introduced copies of documents Catherine had pushed Derek to sign under false pretenses, along with recordings Derek had captured of Catherine bragging about her manipulation. The courtroom grew tense as the judge examined the evidence, her expression stern. Derek sat silently, his heart pounding, but for the first time in years he felt powerful, not because of wealth but because the truth was finally being spoken aloud. Catherine's mask of superiority was gone, replaced with desperation as she whispered furiously to her lawyers, who now looked rattled and uncertain. The judge adjourned the hearing to review the new evidence, but her parting words made it clear that Catherine's case was crumbling. It appears there are serious concerns about fraudulent intent here, and this court will not allow deception to determine the outcome of these proceedings. Catherine's eyes flickered toward Derek, wide with disbelief, as though she could not comprehend that the man she had dismissed as weak and ordinary was now standing firm, shielded by the very legacy she had mocked. Derek met her gaze calmly, no longer shrinking under her disdain, silently thanking his mother for the wisdom and strength she had given him. She believed she had regained control, that Angela's evidence was an exaggeration, that the judge would still bend to her polished performance, but Derek knew the truth could not be hidden any longer. The judge called the court to order and asked both sides to make their final arguments, giving Catherine's lawyer the first opportunity. He stood tall, his voice smooth and commanding, painting Catherine as a woman of generosity who had supported a man who contributed little to their financial standing, insisting that she had always acted in good faith and that the property in question should be liquidated for fairness. Catherine nodded along, her face composed, her confidence radiating outward, but the moment belonged not to her words, but to the truth waiting to be revealed. When Angela rose to speak, the atmosphere shifted, her presence commanding respect as she began laying out the case with precision. She reminded the judge that Catherine had portrayed the land as insignificant, but the official appraisal proved otherwise, establishing its value at more than $12 million due to natural gas reserves. She reminded the judge that Derek's mother had established a trust fund valued at over $2 million, legally structured to remain separate from marital assets, proof of careful planning meant to protect her son from exactly the kind of exploitation he now faced. Catherine's attorney attempted to object, but Angela pressed forward, her voice cutting through the courtroom with unwavering conviction, presenting copies of documents Catherine had pushed Derek to sign under misleading pretenses, as well as the damning recording of her gloating about how easily she had controlled him. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as Catherine's mask slipped, her cheeks flushed, her lips trembling as she whispered urgently to her lawyers. The judge leaned forward, her face stern, her tone sharp as she addressed Catherine directly. "Mrs. Miller, were you aware of the value of these assets? And did you intentionally mislead your husband to gain control over them?" Catherine stammered, her words stumbling as she denied knowledge, but Angela quickly interjected with the recording, and Catherine's own voice filled the courtroom, laughing, mocking Derek as boring and ordinary, boasting that she had signed everything into her name, celebrating the idea of cashing out once she divorced him. The sound of her voice echoing through the chamber sealed her fate. The judge shook her head slowly, her expression filled with disappointment. "This court cannot and will not condone fraud," she declared firmly, and the weight of those words crushed the last remnants of Catherine's arrogance. Derek sat still, his heart pounding, his throat tight, but his eyes never left Catherine as the judge ruled that the prenuptial agreement was void due to fraudulent intent and failure to disclose material facts. The trust fund and the land were to remain entirely in Derek's possession, recognized as separate property belonging solely to him, and beyond that, the judge awarded him half of all marital assets, half of the house, half of the accounts, half of everything Catherine had once claimed as hers. Catherine's mouth fell open in disbelief, her attorneys scrambling but unable to salvage the wreckage of their case. The judge added that Catherine would also be responsible for covering Derek's legal fees and court costs, a final blow that stripped away any illusion of victory. The courtroom was electric with tension, every eye focused on the reversal unfolding before them. Derek felt Angela's hand squeeze his gently, a gesture of triumph and solidarity, and he whispered a quiet thank you, though his gratitude stretched far beyond her to his late mother, whose wisdom and sacrifice had made this moment possible. Catherine's shoulders slumped as the reality set in, her arrogance replaced by fear, her carefully curated image collapsing in front of the very audience she had once sought to impress. The woman who had mocked his career, who had diminished his heritage, who had treated him as disposable, was now revealed to be the one who had underestimated everything. As the gavel fell to close the session, Catherine turned to Derek in desperation, her voice breaking, pleading for a private conversation. He allowed her words to reach his ears but not his heart. She whispered about misunderstandings, about still caring for him, about working things out, but Derek only looked at her with calm clarity. "The only misunderstanding," he said softly, "was mine. I thought you loved me." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but Derek felt no pity. He remembered the countless nights lying awake beside her, the sting of her insults, the laughter in her voice as she mocked him behind his back, and he knew there was no going back. For the first time in years, he felt completely in control, his dignity restored, his worth undeniable. When Derek Johnson stepped out of the courthouse into the bright October sunlight, he felt the crisp air fill his lungs like freedom itself, a release from years of humiliation, betrayal, and quiet suffering. The judge's gavel had closed not just the hearing, but a chapter of his life that had nearly destroyed him. And as reporters crowded around, their questions echoing, Derek moved forward steadily, no longer the man who had once shrunk beneath Catherine Miller's gaze, but a man restored to himself. Catherine trailed behind him, her once perfect composure shattered, her pleas for forgiveness still ringing in his ears, but he refused to turn back. For too long she had dictated his worth, treating him as though his skin color, his career, and his background were liabilities instead of strengths. And now she had been exposed for what she truly was, an architect of greed undone by her own arrogance. Angela Brooks walked beside him, steady and proud, her eyes reflecting the satisfaction of justice served, and Derek squeezed her hand once more, whispering a quiet thank you that carried the weight of his gratitude. But his truest thanks belonged to his mother, the woman who had seen this future from the shadows of her hard work, who had quietly prepared for a day when her son would need protection from a world determined to underestimate him. That night, Derek returned to the modest home he now knew would soon be replaced by something entirely his own, land and trust restored to him, dignity intact. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of documents Angela had given him, proof that his mother's foresight had saved him, and he allowed himself to weep openly for the first time since her death. The tears were not of despair, but of overwhelming gratitude, for she had worked quietly, lived humbly, and sacrificed endlessly so that he could stand tall even in the face of betrayal. Her trust fund had not simply been money, it had been a message, a declaration that he was worthy, that he was enough, that he would always have the means to rise even when others tried to hold him down. The land she had preserved was not just dirt and minerals but legacy, roots that tied him to a story of resilience and strength that Catherine could never touch. Derek whispered into the empty kitchen, "Mama, you were right. I am enough." In the weeks that followed, Catherine tried again to reach him, sending letters, leaving voicemails, showing up at places where she thought he might relent. But Derek had moved beyond her reach. He no longer needed her validation, no longer craved the approval that had once kept him silent while she belittled him. Instead, he poured his energy into something greater. With Angela's help, he established the Lillian Johnson Foundation, a scholarship fund named after his mother dedicated to providing opportunities for underprivileged students, Black, white, Latino, and all backgrounds who carried the same hunger for education that had once fueled him. He funneled part of the trust fund into the foundation, ensuring that generations of young people would benefit from the same belief his mother had instilled in him, that worth is not measured by wealth or status but by character, effort, and the willingness to rise above adversity. The first recipients of the scholarship came from his own high school, students who had sat in his classroom, who had watched him fight quietly through his pain, and when he stood on stage to present the awards, he spoke not of betrayal or revenge, but of resilience. Sometimes, he told them, his voice steady, the people who underestimate you the most are the ones closest to you, but their opinion is not your truth. Your truth is in the work you do, the lives you touch, the dignity you carry every day. Never let anyone convince you that you are less. You are enough. The students and their families applauded, but Derek's eyes lifted upward, silently thanking his mother once more. Catherine faded into obscurity, her reputation damaged by the court's findings, her wealth diminished by legal fees and settlements, and though part of Derek's heart once longed for vengeance, he discovered he no longer needed it. His victory was not in seeing her crumble, but in knowing he had reclaimed himself, in walking forward without bitterness, in using what she meant for harm as a foundation for good. He did not waste energy hating her, because hate would have only chained him to her memory. Instead, he chose to honor the people who mattered, the students who believed in him, the mother who had sacrificed for him, the community that would now benefit from his strength. As time passed, Derek became not only a teacher, but a symbol in his community, proof that injustice could be overcome, proof that dignity could outlast deceit, proof that love and legacy were stronger than greed and prejudice. He still wore the same modest suits to school, still carried the same quiet humor that had drawn Catherine to him years before, but now there was something new in his bearing, an unshakable confidence that came not from wealth, but from knowing who he was. His students noticed, his colleagues noticed, and even strangers noticed the way he carried himself with calm assurance. He no longer questioned whether he belonged in rooms filled with wealth and power, because he had learned that true power was not in money or status, but in the ability to rise with integrity when others tried to keep you down. The end. If you followed Derek's story all the way to the end, I'd love to hear what you think about how it unfolded. Do you believe Catherine ever truly cared for him, or was it always about the land and the money? Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Your perspective helps bring these stories to life for people all around the world. If you want to keep hearing powerful stories about justice, resilience, and dignity, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button so you never miss the next chapter.